Hey, hello everyone. This is the lecture for week 8, Sutton Griggs. And in this lecture I'm going to focus primarily on the issue of nationalism because it's a theme that showed up very strongly in the work of Griggs and other people that are referred to in the lecture. So I began the lecture by talking about the notion that cultural nationalism comes out as a force in American politics, African American politics, pretty much in the period after the Civil War. So during the Civil War and during the era of slavery, the majority of people working for abolitionist causes were looking for ways that African Americans could be seen as part of the group of America. They were not striving to separate themselves from the nation. They were striving to end slavery, but they were largely trying to find ways with which they too could be identified as Americans. This becomes most obvious, I think, in a famous disagreement that Frederick Douglass had with abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Now, William Lloyd Garrison was a white abolitionist, and at the beginning of their careers, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were friends and colleagues. But they had a falling out around their interpretation of the American Constitution. William Lloyd Garrison felt that the American Constitution was a document that upheld slavery and therefore had to be done away with. Whereas Frederick Douglass argued that the Constitution was a document that had ideals stated within it that could be used in the fight against slavery. So for Douglass then, even though he talked about the barriers that he faced in achieving citizenship and achieving participation in the American ideals, he nevertheless saw the Constitution and saw those ideals as something that he wanted to be part of, that he felt that those people who had been brought to Africa as slaves should be allowed to be part of. So Douglass then famously is working not to separate from the notion of America, but to join it. And Douglass, I think, spoke for a good number of African Americans during the period of slavery, during the antebellum era. After the Civil War, there was a larger number of people who became interested in ideas of separatism and ideas of cultural nationalism that defined African Americans as something different, something separate from the American nation. This is why Martin Delany made his trip to Africa. He was going to scope out territory that he hoped that former slaves could use as a territory for their own colonization, so they could have a territory they could claim as their own and identify with. Delany also believed that perhaps in the American West, which at this time was not fully colonized, could also be used as an area where Africans in the Americas could have as a homeland. So for Martin Delany and for many others, it was very important, actually, to have a geographic territory that black people could identify with and be associated with. So Martin Delany, then, in this period of the 19th century, is not working as a cultural nationalist so much as a nationalist according to its sort of traditional definition, in that he's looking for territory to establish this group. He is looking at race as being another primary factor of identifying who is African American, who is not, but he's also struggling to find a geographic territory around which they can base their experience. Now, as some of you point out in your posts, the idea of nationalism that Garvey supports and that others have supported from different perspectives, whether it be African American nationalism or American nationalism or Irish nationalism, what have you, nationalism has been used in some ways that are awful and horrid, and some ways that are very positive and to the good. So nationalism has been used to kill and murder people, to cause genocide. Nationalism has been used to save people, to create homelands for people so they can grow and they can live. So nationalism has been used in both of these different kind of perspectives, and that's important to keep in mind. Now, for people who are part of a diaspora, which means people who are dispersed away from a traditional homeland, particularly African Americans who are cut off from this homeland by the sense of the Middle Passage, and therefore don't have any direct identification with some home country in Africa that they can turn to. Well, for people in this situation, the notion of regular nationalism, nationalism based around geography, is often problematic because they have no geographical territory to turn to. And for this group of people, the turn towards cultural nationalism is often seen as a beneficial move to sort of find a way to organize this group of people. So they are organized around cultural practice. And by what I mean by that is that they're organized around the sense that a group of people have a historic record of taking part in certain kinds of cultural activities, whether it be kinds of food or whether it be ways of living and home building, whether it be styles of clothing, whether it be music. There are a number of cultural practices that have been passed down from generation to generation, and by participating in that series of cultural practices, that's how one is a member of the group or not, by taking part in these cultural practices. So with this sense of cultural nationalism, many African Americans turned towards cultural nationalism in the 19th century and up into the present day, actually, as a primary means of identifying who is part of the group and who is not, and then using that group identity as a means of motivating people towards improving the community, motivating people towards taking action on the large scale that would help improve their conditions. So if that's what cultural nationalism can be used for, and the positive steps that cultural nationalism can be used for, it should be noted that cultural nationalism also has some problems associated with it as well. One of the issues associated with cultural nationalism, particularly in terms of these historic passed down cultural practices, is, well, what does one do when cultural practices change? And also, what does one do when individuals who would otherwise be seen as part of the group refuse to take part in those cultural practices? In the event of individuals who refuse to take part in those practices, does this mean that they are no longer part of the group? So if you take a person who is visibly black, right, someone who identifies black based upon skin color, but that person doesn't take part in practices that we see as being culturally black. So that person doesn't eat black foods. That person doesn't listen to black music. That person doesn't do this, that, or the other thing that we see as being cultural practices of black Americans. Well, is that person who is otherwise visually black, do we consider that person to be a black American or not? If they are born, raised here in the U.S., and they just simply choose, I want to eat this, I want to live that way, I want to do this particular kind of thing, does that mean they're no longer part of that group if they're no longer taking part in those cultural practices? Another issue with cultural nationalist practices is that with all cultures, these practices evolve and change over time. So if you look at the history of African Americans, the kinds of foods that we eat in the present day are different than the kinds of foods that we ate in the past. So if taking part or being a member of African American cultural practices is following this set of traditional practices, and in the present day fewer people are doing those particular traditional practices, does this mean that the present day people are no longer African Americans in the way that those past African Americans were, since they had the real, the true, the authentic sense of what those cultural practices were? So both of these become not insurmountable problems, but they are ones that are notable and worth discussion in terms of how one identifies as a cultural nationalist. Right? What are the practices you're identifying, which are the historic cultural practices, and what does it mean if one doesn't take part in all of those practices? How does one affirm one's membership if one doesn't do those particular practices? So those are the primary kind of issues around nationalism and cultural nationalism, and they become increasingly important in later discussions of African American work. Right, so as you get into the 1960s in particular, the notion of cultural nationalism really comes to the foreground. Then the 19-teens and 1920s also. I think that there is a link that one of you posted to discussions about Marcus Garvey and the Pan-Africanist movement that came about in the 19-teens, 1920s. That's another version of African American cultural nationalism that was looking for geographic territory, so that it might become a more traditional kind of a nationalist kind of an ideal. All of these notions of cultural nationalism become a major and recurring thread in African American culture and African American literature that we need to look for. So we see it surfacing in Griggs. We'll see it more strongly in the work of W.B. Du Bois, which we'll be reading for this week. So all of that is just to say that cultural nationalism emerges at the end of the 19th century and will continue to be a major voice in African American literary culture. So I think those are the major points that I want to address about the issue of cultural nationalism. And thanks.